Hey everyone, welcome back. In this video, we're going to explore the responsibility to protect doctrine. The responsibility to protect is a principle in international law that was first outlined in the 2005 World Summit Outcome document, approved without opposition by the United Nations General Assembly. Specifically, according to paragraph 138, it encompasses every state's responsibility to protect its populations from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. This responsibility entails the prevention of such crimes, including their incitement, through appropriate and necessary means. But the responsibility to protect also articulates the responsibility on the part of the international community to act collectively where individual states are either unwilling or unable to do so. Specifically, paragraph 139 asserts that the international community, through the United Nations, has the responsibility to use appropriate diplomatic, humanitarian, and other peaceful means to help protect populations from genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing. In this context, we are prepared to take collective action in a timely and decisive manner through the Security Council should peaceful means be inadequate and national authorities manifestly fail to protect their population from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. In other words, the responsibility to protect reflects the overlapping and shared interests of the state and the international community to protect people from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. Under the responsibility to protect, sovereignty entails a responsibility to ensure the safety and well-being of a state's own population, and that when a state is unwilling or unable to fulfill this responsibility, it's the responsibility on the part of the international community to act. More broadly, the responsibility to protect builds on three pillars. First, that it is the responsibility of the state to protect its population. Under the responsibility to protect, the primary responsibility for protecting populations rests with individual states, and governments are responsible for preventing and addressing mass atrocities within their territory. This pillar addresses the state's duty to promote and safeguard the human rights and security of its citizens. Second, it's the responsibility of the international community to assist states in meeting that obligation. Assistance can take various forms, including capacity building, diplomatic efforts, humanitarian aid, and technical support, with the aim of helping states prevent and address mass atrocities. And finally, when that assistance fails and the state is unwilling or unable to protect its population, it's the responsibility of the international community to assume responsibility to protect and to intervene to protect the people. Such intervention could take a variety of forms, ranging from diplomatic and economic pressure to coercive measures, including military intervention as a last resort when authorized by the United Nations Security Council. It's worth noting that the responsibility to protect doctrine presents a more nuanced view of state sovereignty than is traditionally dominated global politics. The UN Charter and international law more broadly historically gave great weight to the idea of sovereignty, giving states great latitude in their internal affairs. However, the idea of state sovereignty and the principle of non-interference in the domestic affairs of states began, particularly after World War II, to give way to a more nuanced perspective that recognized some situations in which the international community might have an interest in the otherwise internal affairs of a country. An early and widely cited example of this centered on the question of apartheid, or the forced racial segregation in South Africa. Between 1948 and 1994, a white minority government ruled the country, denying basic human rights and political representation to the black majority. While the South African government regularly maintained that the issue was a purely internal matter and outside the jurisdiction of the international community, the United Nations General Assembly regularly passed resolutions condemning the system, calling for its end, and demanding the release of Nelson Mandela and other black leaders from prison. The United Nations maintained that the issue had broader regional and global implications, and that national sovereignty and the principle of non-intervention could not be invoked to avoid accountability. In many ways, the current debate over the responsibility to protect is grappling with similar issues. By emphasizing the primary responsibility for protecting populations lies with the states themselves, Pillar 1 of the responsibility to protect acknowledges the principle of state sovereignty. But the responsibility to protect introduces a broader understanding of sovereignty, arguing that sovereignty is not an absolute right, but instead entails responsibilities, including the protection of populations from mass atrocities. This responsibility to protect also challenges the notion of absolute non-intervention in the domestic affairs of states, limiting a country's ability to shield itself from international attention, or perhaps even intervention, by evoking the principle. R2P makes the international community responsible for the protection of people from crimes against humanity. As such, it does not advocate for arbitrary or unilateral intervention, but instead emphasizes collective action authorized by the UN Security Council as a legitimate response to grave humanitarian crises. In other words, the responsibility to protect seeks to reconcile the responsibility of states to protect their own populations with the international community's duty to prevent and respond to mass atrocities. It acknowledges that sovereignty carries with it the responsibility to protect populations, and it's only when a state is unable or unwilling to fulfill this responsibility that intervention becomes a consideration. The international community's intervention under the R2P is not a rejection of sovereignty, rather it's an assertion that the responsibility to protect populations transcends claims of absolute sovereignty. In practice, of course, navigating the complex balance between state sovereignty, non-intervention, and the responsibility to protect remains a complex and contentious task. While the responsibility to protect doctrine formally emerged in the early 2000s, the historical development of the responsibility to protect doctrine is rooted in the evolution of international norms and responses to humanitarian crises. Its earliest roots can be traced to the development of international humanitarian law, which we explore in another video, which emerged largely in response to the Holocaust and the atrocities committed during World War II. And its more immediate roots lie in the development of the 1990s. At the end of the Cold War, there was a good deal of optimism about the renewed potential of the international community to address threats to peace and security and to work together to protect human rights. In one of the earliest tests of this resolve, the international community collectively responded to Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in 1991 when a massive coalition of countries worked under the authorization of the UN Security Council to force Iraq to withdraw from the country. But other tests soon followed, and the international community's response was less effective, and there are three that are particularly noteworthy. The first test occurred in Somalia. In the early 1990s, Somalia was racked by civil war, which eventually resulted in the division of the country into a number of regions controlled by competing militias and the outbreak of famine and a massive refugee crisis in the country. The United Nations Security Council responded by authorizing the deployment of a new peacekeeping mission dubbed the United Nations Operation in Somalia, or UNOSOM. The original operation was established in April 1992 and was tasked with providing humanitarian assistance in the country and monitoring a ceasefire between the various factions. By December, that mission was replaced by UNOSOM-2, and its mission was expanded to include disarming Somali militias and restoring order in the country. The UN operation was supplemented by a U.S. military initiative, Operation Restore Hope, which had a similar objective. The mission was initially successful in providing humanitarian assistance and disarming some of the Somali militias. However, the mission faced increasing resistance from some other militias, particularly the militia led by General Mohammed Farah Aidid. In October 1993, a U.S.-led task force was sent to Somalia to capture Aidid. The force was ambushed by Aidid's militia, and in the ensuing battle, 18 U.S. soldiers and between 200 and 500 Somalis were killed, and 73 U.S. soldiers and an estimated 2,000 Somalis were wounded. The battle, which became known as Black Hawk Down, was a major setback for the United Nations mission in Somalia. U.S. forces withdrew from Somalia, and the UN mission was ultimately terminated. The mission's failure had several key impacts. It helped raise the awareness around the need for humanitarian intervention and the challenges associated with peacekeeping. The traditional UN model of peacekeeping was ill-suited for the contemporary post-Cold War challenges of the international system, and the United Nations was to undertake a series of self-studies to reflect on how to better position UN peacekeeping operations for success. In particular, the Somali mission highlighted the importance of improving international cooperation in addressing complex humanitarian crises. But the failure of the U.S. mission in Somalia also led to the United States to begin to pull back from a more expansive role it had assumed in the international system after the end of the Cold War. In particular, the United States proved less willing to deploy American forces in support of humanitarian operations when there was no clear U.S. national interest at stake. The second major development leading to the responsibility to protect doctrine was the Rwandan Genocide, when, over a period of around 100 days, from April to July 1994, an estimated 800,000 people, mostly ethnic Tutsis and moderate Hutus, were killed. Millions more were displaced, and the country was left in ruins, and the broader regional stability was undermined, leading to conflicts in a number of neighboring countries. Tragically, the United Nations had a peacekeeping mission already on the ground when the genocide started. The United Nations Assistant Mission in Rwanda, or UNAMIR, was deployed in October 1993 in order to monitor the implementation of the Arusha Accords, a peace agreement between the Hutu-led Rwandan government and the opposition Tutsi-led Rwandan Patriotic Front. In the months leading up to the genocide, UNAMIR commanders warned the Security Council that there was an increasing risk of violence. However, the Security Council did not take any action to prevent the genocide. Requests from UNAMIR commanders in Rwanda to deploy additional peacekeepers to prevent the outbreak of violence were ignored by the Security Council. In his memoir, Romeo Dallaire, the Canadian general in command of the UN Assistance Mission in Rwanda, recalls requesting additional peacekeeping soldiers in January 1994. He warned that there was a risk of violence and that the existing UN force was too small to prevent it. However, the UN Security Council rejected his request, and there were several reasons for this. First, there was a lack of political will to intervene in Rwanda. The UN Security Council was reluctant to send more peacekeepers to a country where there was a risk of political violence, especially after the failure of the UN peacekeeping mission in Somalia. The United States was not particularly interested in supporting the expanded operation in Rwanda. As one of the only countries in the world with the airlift capacity to rapidly deploy large number of soldiers around the world, U.S. support for the mission was viewed as critical to its success. But the humiliating defeat of the U.S. operation in Mogadishu less than a year earlier left the U.S. hesitant to get involved in a conflict where there was not a clear national interest at stake. Second, there was a lack of resources. The UN was already stretched thin by peacekeeping operations in other parts of the world, and there was little money to pay for more peacekeepers and equipment in Rwanda. Finally, many in the UN bureaucracy did not trust Dallaire, believing he was exaggerating the risk of violence in Rwanda and that he was too close to the RPF, the Tutsi-led rebel group that was fighting against the Hutu-led government. And so, when the violence did break out, UNAMIR proved unable to prevent the genocide. Indeed, instead of taking action to protect civilians against violence, the United Nations reduced UNAMIR's mandate and withdrew most of its forces from the country. This was driven in part by concerns that peacekeeping soldiers might themselves become targets of violence in the country. But some have argued that the UN was forced to withdraw its forces because it was concerned the organization would be financially responsible for any peacekeepers killed or injured, or any equipment lost or damaged in the fighting, further endangering its precarious financial position. And so the genocide was free to run its course, ending only in July when Rwandan Patriotic Front soldiers recaptured the country. The UN's failure to prevent the Rwandan genocide was perhaps the most widely recognized failure of the organization, but it was also a failure of U.S. policy that created the conditions that permitted the genocide to occur. Indeed, speaking in Kigali, the capital of Rwanda in 1998, President Bill Clinton lamented that the international community, together with the nations in Africa, must bear its share of responsibility for this tragedy. We did not act quickly enough as the killing began. We should not have allowed the refugee camps to become a safe haven for the killers. We did not immediately call these crimes by their rightful name, genocide. We cannot change the past, but we can and must do everything in our power to help you build a future without fear and full of hope. The third major event in this period was the war in Kosovo, fought between the forces of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, which controlled Kosovo before the war, and the Kosovo Albanian rebel group known as the Kosovo Liberation Army. Ethnic Albanians in Kosovo had long sought independence from Serbia, and they had begun to engage in a low-level insurgency against Serbian rule in the 1990s. In 1998, the insurgency escalated, and the KLA began to launch attacks on Serbian security forces. The Serbian government responded with a brutal crackdown, which included the use of tanks, artillery, and paramilitary forces. The violence in Kosovo led to a humanitarian crisis, with hundreds of thousands of people displaced from their homes and more than 10,000 people killed during the war. In September 1998, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 1199, which called for an end to the violence in Kosovo and for the withdrawal of Serbian security forces from the province. However, the Serbian government refused to comply with the resolution. Frustrated with the slow pace of United Nations action in Kosovo, NATO launched its own operation in Kosovo in March 1999, commencing a massive bombing campaign against Serbian targets. The campaign lasted for 78 days, ultimately forcing the withdrawal of Yugoslav forces from Kosovo. The NATO mission was highly controversial. While the United States, the United Kingdom, Italy, and France pushed hard for intervention, other NATO members, most notably France and Germany, were far more hesitant. Proponents of NATO intervention argued that it was necessary to prevent a massive humanitarian catastrophe in Kosovo and that decisive NATO action would deter future Serbian aggression in the region. But NATO was operating without UN Security Council approval. Indeed, it was not until the passage of Resolution 1244 on June 10, 1999, that the United Nations would take decisive action. By this point, the NATO campaign was drawing to a close, and Serbian forces in Kosovo had largely been defeated. Nevertheless, the passage of Resolution 1244 was significant as it authorized an international civilian and military presence in the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia and established the United Nations Interim Assistance Mission in Kosovo, which was tasked with overseeing the transition of Kosovo from a Serbian province to an independent state. The failure of the Security Council to address the crisis in Kosovo before unilateral NATO intervention further fueled the push to develop the responsibility to protect, and it also marked a shift in UN policy towards a more proactive approach to protecting civilians in combat zones. Interestingly, though, the African Union would beat the United Nations to the punch. In 2000, the African Union asserted it had the right and responsibility to intervene in situations where a state is failing to protect its populations from mass atrocity crimes. This responsibility is enshrined in Article 4 of the African Union's Constitutive Act, which recognizes the right of the Union to intervene in a member state pursuant to a decision by the Assembly in respect of grave circumstances, namely war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity. But for the United Nations, reaching the responsibility to protect would take a few more years. In the year 2000, the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty was convened by the Canadian government to examine the international community's response to humanitarian crises. The ICISS final report, titled The Responsibility to Protect, was released in 2001. The report argued that sovereignty does not mean states have the right to do whatever they want to their own people. Rather, it maintained that sovereignty entails a responsibility to protect the people within a state from serious harm. When a state is unwilling or unable to protect its people, the international community has a responsibility to step in and do so. Moreover, the ICISS report outlined three components of the responsibility to protect. A responsibility to prevent, meaning the international community has a responsibility to prevent mass atrocities from happening in the first place. This can be done through a variety of means such as diplomacy, sanctions, or development assistance. A responsibility to react. When a state is unwilling or unable to prevent mass atrocities, the international community has a responsibility to take concrete steps through a variety of means, such as humanitarian intervention, peacekeeping, and peace building to stop such atrocities. And finally, a responsibility to rebuild, which requires the international community to help rebuild the country and provide aid for the victims, for example, by providing development assistance, justice and reconciliation mechanisms, and security sector reform. While the ICISS report was criticized for its idealism and for not providing a clear roadmap on how the international community should respond to mass atrocities, it nevertheless represented an early, comprehensive, and thoughtful approach to the issue of humanitarian intervention. The report was widely welcomed by the international community and helped to legitimize the concept of humanitarian intervention by providing a framework for thinking about when and how the international community should intervene to protect people from harm. And it was the ICISS report that provided the basis for the 2005 World Summit and its outcome document, which affirmed the principles of the responsibility to protect and stated it was the responsibility of the state to protect its populations from these crimes. It also emphasized the responsibility of the international community to help states fulfill their obligations and the possibility of collective action through the UN Security Council when states fail to do so. Since its adoption in 2005, the responsibility to protect has been referenced by the Security Council more than 80 times, including in resolutions addressing crises in Darfur, Libya, Côte d'Ivoire, Yemen, Mali, and Sudan, among others. But a few cases warrant a little more attention. Following the disputed presidential election in Kenya in December 2007, a series of inter-ethnic clashes erupted. The violence, which lasted for several months, resulted in the deaths of over 1,100 people and the displacement of up to 300,000. The violence was sparked by allegations of electoral fraud, but largely occurred along ethnic lines. The violence was quickly condemned by the international community. The UN Security Council called for an end to the violence and urged the Kenyan government to take action to protect its citizens. The African Union also sent a peacekeeping force to Kenya to help restore peace and stability. Mediation efforts by UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon led to the establishment of a power-sharing agreement in the country and established national commissions in Kenya to investigate the violence and to review the outcome of the elections. The rapid and coordinated response of the international community under the rubric of the responsibility to protect was heralded as a model case in the principle of action. The 2011 civil war in Côte d'Ivoire provides another example of the effective and successful use of the responsibility to protect. In late 2010, following another disputed presidential election, a civil war broke out in the country, forcing hundreds of thousands of people from their homes and resulting in thousands of people killed. The violence was also marked by widespread human rights abuses, including extrajudicial killings, torture, and sexual violence. The international community responded to the crisis by imposing sanctions on the government of Laurent Gbagbo, the incumbent president who refused to step down after losing the election. The UN Security Council also authorized the use of force to protect civilians, in response to which the French and UN forces intervened militarily, leading to the ousting and ultimately the arrest, trial, and acquittal of Gbagbo at the International Criminal Court. In this case, the international community's intervention was successful in restoring a democratically elected government to power, preventing a larger humanitarian catastrophe, and in restoring peace and stability to the country. The intervention also helped to strengthen the principle of R2P and to show that the international community was willing to act to prevent mass atrocities from being committed against civilians. However, not all cases of the use of the responsibility to protect have been successful. In February 2011, massive protests erupted in Libya against the government of Muammar Gaddafi. The protests quickly turned violent, and the Libyan government responded with force. By March, the violence had escalated into a full-blown civil war. The UN Security Council responded to the crisis by passing Resolution 1970, which made explicit references to the responsibility to protect, deploring what it called the gross and systemic human rights violations in the country, emphasizing the Libyan government's responsibility to protect its population, and imposing a series of international sanctions. The Council also decided to refer the situation to the International Criminal Court. 3 weeks later, the Security Council passed Resolution 1973, which authorized member states to take all necessary measures, language that permits the use of force, to protect civilians under threat in Libya. A few days later, under the UN Security Council authorization, NATO forces commenced attacks and quickly defeated Gaddafi's forces, but the country soon fell into chaos. The failure of the international community to follow up on the airstrikes and military defeat of the Gaddafi government with meaningful foreign aid, security assistance, and stabilization efforts led to widespread criticism. Indeed, India's ambassador to the United Nations, Hardeep Singh Puri, stated that the Libyan case has already given R2P a bad name, and that the only aspect of the resolution of interest to them, the international community, was the use of all necessary means to bomb the hell out of Libya. And this lack of follow-through commitment is not the only criticism leveled against the implementation of the responsibility to protect doctrine. The successful application of R2P requires not just short-term military intervention, but longer-term reconstruction efforts. Without that commitment, the responsibility to protect intervention is likely to exacerbate instability rather than to ameliorate it. Some critics argue that the responsibility to protect has been selectively implemented, leading to a perception of bias and inconsistency in international interventions. Powerful states may choose to intervene based on their political interests rather than on genuine humanitarian concerns, undermining the universality and impartiality of the R2P doctrine. With selective implementation comes accusations of abuse of the process itself. As a result, interventions purportedly based on the R2P doctrine may merely provide a pretext for military interventions that may not always prioritize the protection of the population. Instead, they can be driven by hidden agendas or geopolitical considerations rather than a genuine commitment to protecting civilians. This is particularly a concern for many countries in the global south, who are concerned that the R2P may provide a justification for Western intervention in their internal affairs, rather than actually being concerned about protecting people from harm. Such critics often point to the intervention in Libya as an example of how R2P can be used to justify intervention in a country that is not a threat to international peace and security. Such intervention infringes on the principle of state sovereignty, as it allows external actors to intervene in the internal affairs of sovereign states and may provide justification for undue interference or even regime change, undermining the autonomy and self-determination of states. Critics of the 2011 NATO intervention in Libya often point to that case as an example of this, maintaining that despite the justification that the intervention was aimed at protecting civilians, its real purpose was to enable foreign military involvement in the internal affairs of Libya, leading to regime change and a power vacuum in the country. And even when driven by legitimate concerns over human rights violations, R2P interventions may have unintended negative consequences, such as exacerbating violence, escalating conflict, or leading to prolonged instability or humanitarian crises. This is true when there is insufficient planning or poor coordination in post-intervention phases, undermining the effectiveness of R2P and resulting in harm to the populations it seeks to protect. Despite all this, R2P remains a widely accepted doctrine in international law. It's been endorsed by the UN Security Council and by many governments around the world. However, the debate over R2P is likely to continue for many years to come. But that's it for now. Please leave any questions you have in the comments section below, and thanks for watching. Bye.